It's January 24, 2023. A small US investment firm known for its market activism releases a new strategy.
Looking elsewhere in the markets today, major short seller Hindenburg Research putting out a market-moving call on...
The group, Hindenburg Research, is betting on a particular company's stock price falling, a practice known as taking a short position. This time, it's betting against one of India's biggest companies, the Adani Group. Adani's share price has gone up 2,400% in just 3 years, and Hindenburg predicts it's about to fall.
This really goes straight to the heart of the empire of one of the richest people in the world, and it's having an effect across his different companies. Yeah, absolutely, Julie. We're seeing some big...
Why? Well, Hindenburg claims that the world's third richest man, Gautam Adani, was pulling off what they called the biggest con in corporate history. After a 2-year investigation, the firm says that Adani's conglomerate engaged in a brazen stock manipulation and accounting fraud scheme that has been going on for decades. They allege an elaborate scam involving shell companies, stock price gaming, and significant undisclosed debt. Hindenburg's shock announcement sets off a chain of events.
The fundamentals of our company are very strong, and we have an impeccable track record of fulfilling our debt obligations.
That's Gautam Adani. He and his company emphatically reject the allegations as his chief financial officer hits the screens.
This report was a deliberate and a malicious attempt aimed at damaging our reputation.
Within days, the company delivers a mammoth 413-page response claiming this is an attack not only on Adani Group, but the entire country of India.
A US-based short seller published a report to short our stocks, just as we are planning to launch the largest follow-on public offering in India's history.
Nevertheless, the stock price falls off a cliff.
And the sell-off in shares of Adani Group continues, the fallout real for billionaire owners.
So one of India's biggest companies is facing an unprecedented crisis. The Adani Group has lost...
Shares dropped by as much as 70%. And by the end of the first week, the Adani name loses an estimated $100 billion.
The Adani Group's 7 listed companies have plummeted in market value
by May,
after a report.
The Indian Supreme Court investigation into the matter is finished. They say the allegations against Adani are false. The Securities and Exchange Board tells the court it has drawn a blank in its probe. But deep in the pages of the Hindenburg team's research is a warning from an anonymous employee. It says that if the Modi government goes out of power, maybe the whole thing will come crashing down. From the lands of the Kulin Nation, my name is Emma Hoy. This is Leave It to the Experts. Welcome to episode 4 of our in-depth look at the Indian election. This time, we're looking at the Indian economic miracle. So is India's meteoric economic rise all that it seems? And what might stop India becoming the powerhouse that many believe it's destined to be? At the top of the enormously intricate social ladder of Indian life sit 2 names, Adani and Ambani, both from Gujarati families, both titans of Indian industry. Their company and personal wealth are worth around $200 billion. The Ambani family owns what is known as Reliance Industries. They dominate telecommunications, natural gas projects, the largest oil refinery in the world. They own the Indian Premier League cricket franchise, the Mumbai Indians. Its head, Mukesh Ambani, is the richest man in Asia, who publicly shows his love for the government of Narendra Modi at every opportunity.
Our nation has transformed remarkably since you have become Prime Minister in 2014. Guided by your vision and driven by a laser-sharp focus on execution of
Then there's the Adani Group, who we heard about earlier, the largest manager of air and seaports and the second largest producer of cement and electricity generation in India. The 2 dynasties dominate India's economy, and India's opposition thinks they know why.
Opposition went up in arms against the lack of no debate on the Adani-Hindenburg report fallout.
This election, the opposition has continued to attack the government, claiming that Narendra Modi is too close with the leaders of these companies.
There does seem to be a very, very nice parallel between the rise of Narendra Modi and the rise of Gautam Adani. And the rumors that he's close to them...
In episode 3, we discussed the enormous electoral boost Modi has received from his association with India's booming economy. However, for all that ballot box power, certain businesses have benefited more from the enormous wealth created than others. To spur the enormous growth project, particularly since Modi took government in 2014, India took on a massive infrastructure campaign across the country.
Has revealed India will increase infrastructure investment by 11.3 billion US dollars.
Billions upon billions spent on roads, ports, airports and railway lines. According to the Wall Street Journal, just 6 Indian conglomerates now control or have major stakes in 25% of India's ports, almost half of its cement production, a third of steelmaking, nearly 60% of all telecom subscriptions, and nearly half of all coal imports. Some say these companies are just the best at lobbying hard for government contracts. For others, it feeds the allegation that India has fallen prey to crony capitalism, a term used to describe a group of oligarchs who dominate industry based on their political associations more than their experience or merit.
Yeah, they say you can start and end your day with Tata.
Among others, this charge has been levelled at India's largest conglomerate, Tata, who came to global prominence as a steel company in the late 19th and early 20th century, who have bought car companies, airlines and hotels, and now intend to work with the Indian government to make semiconductors at a new factory in Gujarat.
Yes, Tata Group will begin producing semiconductors in the country within a few years, a move that the chairman...
Or Adani Group, becoming one of India's largest private airport operators, winning the tender to manage 6 at once despite never having worked in the industry before, and going on to become the largest operator.
In one stroke, we have become the largest airport operator in India.
Some have accused Adani of using political power to get the contract. Adani just says they bid the most money. Reliance Industries face similar accusations, but told the Wall Street Journal it doesn't receive special treatment from the Modi government either. Instead, Reliance claims, Modi's goals and the goals of its chairman Ambani overlap. But this election, the script has flipped.
Now Prime Minister Modi bowled a reverse swing and then charged at Rahul Gandhi, saying, why have they suddenly stopped making a mention and targeting us not anymore?
Narendra Modi has gone on the attack, claiming the Congress, his opposition, is too close with Ambani and Adani.
Is he saying that Ambani and Adani are giving black money in tempos to Congress leaders? Why bring in Adani?
2 of the richest men in Asia are now being used as a political football in the dying embers of an election campaign. Modi's accusations of black money flowing towards the Congress has fueled conspiracy theories. But as of yet, these accusations are still nothing more than just claims, untested in courts and by market regulators, and Adani and Ambani are unblemished, despite the political attacks against them. By May this year, Adani Group had made back all the money lost from the Hindenburg research allegations. The impact from Modi's accusations are yet to be totalled. So how big a deal is crony capitalism in India? To help us answer that question, let's bring in our first guest, Subir Sinha. Professor Sinha is an associate professor and director of South Asia Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University in London. All right, Dr. Sinha, India's incredible economic rise in recent decades has certainly seen plenty of winners, some arguably winning far more than others. So could you tell me a little bit about crony capitalism and the role that many believe it now plays in India's economy?
Well, you're right. I mean, India's had spectacularly high growth, basically not just in the last 10 years, but probably going back 2 decades now. In fact, in the period before the big financial crisis of 2009, you probably had higher growth than any other part of India's post-independence history. We've also seen massive concentration of wealth. So the term crony capitalism is often used to describe Indian economic growth and Indian capitalism. And I'm a slight skeptic of this term, and I'll tell you why. I think all capitalism has a degree of croniness within. And, if you looked at historically, as nations were going through patches of great economic growth, you would have seen that one or two or three business houses would have dominated that particular process. And I think what I would explain that as that in order for capitalism to be the engine of growth, it has to accumulate. So the role of crony capitalism is absolutely central in the India growth story. So, for example, if you look at Mr. Modi's particular model, where he's very keen on his understanding of the East Asian models, the Japanese and the Korean models in particular, and to some extent the Singaporean model, one of the things that he likes about that is that certain business houses had access to the state. So a Sony or something in the case of Japan, or Samsung or Daewoo, and they would make things across the board. I mean, the reason why they would prefer that is that to have a fewer number of capitalists would be easier to coordinate from the point of view of the state manager. But the trade-off for that is that it encourages a kind of cultivated connection with the elected leader, in which disproportionate amounts of campaign finance could go towards one politician, and conversely, a disproportionate amount of contracts for mining or infrastructure or things like that would go to a handful of capitalists.
So we have this kind of mutually beneficial relationship where a small group of businessmen or industry interests has kind of privileged access to policymakers and decision leaders. Could you give me some specific examples within India of this happening?
Well, most famously, of course, the Adani Group, and to, I think, a slightly lesser extent, the Ambani Group. If you look at the rise of Adani, it's really fairly obscure, small shopkeeper about 15 to 20 years ago, maybe in the early 2000s. From that point onwards, the sort of very close overlap between the rise of Modi and the rise of Adani. So let me firstly say that it was not just Modi or the BJP that gave a lot of contracts to Adani. The previous government also did. But Adani's sort of career graph and Modi's career graph have been extremely close. Famously, Modi gave him contracts for construction of a mega port in Gujarat, the so-called Mundra port. Over time, you can see that Adani has had a university, though it physically does not exist. But they've been given awards for academic excellence. Container transshipment facilities, large ports, massive number of contracts for the maintenance and even construction of domestic airports, railway lines. All of these have been part and parcel of what Adani has received. And of course, there's a famous photograph of Modi, I think in 2013, with Mr. Adani inside his airplane, which he was going to use for campaign. And this is not a secret, and they haven't done this in any kind of a covert way.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously you've mentioned that Adani and Modi have kind of shared this parallel rise and have seemingly had quite a close working relationship for some time. But it now appears that there might be cracks forming in that relationship. We've had recent comments from Modi saying that Adani might actually be supporting the opposition party. So why do you think that is now occurring, those sort of fractures in their relationship?
So two reasons for that. One, I think, is that you can see that as a success of the opposition's and especially Rahul Gandhi's, election campaign. He had been accusing Modi of crony capitalism going back at least 1 year and perhaps even longer. But the sharpness and the intensity and frequency of those attacks in the last several months leading up to the elections and during the elections has definitely increased. And I think it is a sign of the success because they wrong-footed Modi into making a statement such as the ones that he made, accusing his two main backers of actually supporting the opposition. The second thing is, as business houses that control many sectors of the economy, Adani actually bought one of the last independent television stations in India, NDTV. earlier in the year because one of their main anchors, Ravish Kumar, had been relentless in his criticism on the Modi government and its record on corruption, but also human rights and things like that. At that point, Mr. Adani had made a statement that this was a gift to the Prime Minister, and the role of television stations should not just be to be critical of the government, they should also be praising the government if that was merited. So, the idea that Modi actually came ahead and attacked, Adani and Ambani in his speeches shows that he is on uncertain ground to some extent as to how this is playing out in the public. Because the way in which the opposition was able to turn the narrative was while Modi was going Hindu versus Muslim, and his party particularly was going Hindu versus Muslim, the opposition tried to convert that into a rich versus poor kind of a split in the voting public. Modi made the argument recently as well that it's the very rich who ultimately create employment, and that employment is the kind of mechanism through which the benefits of growth get widely distributed among the population. So if you can imagine someone at the age of 18, 10 years ago, enthusiastically embracing Modi's development paradigm, where he had also promised millions of jobs per year, then these people are now 28 and they're still not employed, and they are kind of effectively staring down the barrel of long-term unemployability. So I think that is a very volatile and maybe even election-turning group of voters. Unemployed youth have had a role to play in Indian politics going back decades. And in fact, in the movement against Mrs. Gandhi's national emergency, they were pretty much at the forefront. Modi statements such as, frying pakoras is also a job, etc. These things don't go down too well in this particular demographic.
We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
India's economy is soaring. The fastest growing major economy is expanding at an annual rate of 6 to 7%. Its economy is now bigger than the UK's and will overtake Germany and Japan in the next few years.
India will be the third largest economy soon.
India, which is set to grow more than 6% this year. That's more than any other major economy.
And the GDP growth rate that has been released by the government has exceeded expectations. The financial year
In 2023 alone, India added 94 new billionaires to its rich list. 240 million people are said to have been brought out of poverty in the last decade. These are major achievements, regardless of which politician claims them. However, the enormous wealth being generated within the Indian economy doesn't flow down to all Indians. Because the rough side to India's economic boom story is the fact that not everyone gets a piece of the pie. The dominance of these huge business groups is potentially choking competition and innovation. To prove this, let's take a look at India's youth unemployment rate. 65% of Indians are under the age of 35 years old, yet this is the age group that is most likely to be unemployed.
Around 8 million young Indians enter the job market annually, which is already oversaturated. All that many find is disappointment.
The jobless rate for university graduates in India last year was floating at around 29%. Some put it as high as 42% for total youth unemployment. The International Labour Organization estimates that the unemployment rate for young people with secondary or higher education was 6 times higher in India, than those who didn't have education at all. So what causes this? Bureaucracy can stifle the growth of new and innovative companies, while some say these students just aren't studying relevant topics. It is creating an enormous gulf in Indian society, where a quality education doesn't assure you of a secure future. Wealth is a curious thing in India. There's plenty of it around, but not everyone has it. The top 1% of India's richest hold on to 40% of the wealth. According to a report from a series of UN agencies, almost 3/4 of the population cannot afford healthy food. The growing gap of wealth inequality means that the richest in India hold more income now than they did under British rule. And that gap is widening. So how damaging is this increasing split in India's economy? Let's ask our next guest, Nitin Kumar Bharti, a postdoctoral scholar in the economics department of the New York University, Abu Dhabi. So Dr. Bharti, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you've conducted extensive research on wealth inequality in India. So could you tell us a little bit about this research and sort of some of your key findings?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me. In this paper, we have highlighted the inequality measures, both along income as well as wealth. Now, to put some figures in your mind, from 1961 up until 1981, 45% of the national wealth was owned by top 10% of the population. It has increased now to 65%, so a gain of 20 percentage points. Similarly, if you look even within top 10%, just the top 1% of the population, there you will see that today the top 1% owns about 40% of the national aggregate wealth. So there's a huge jump. And here I would like to point out that in the last 10 years, there is a rise in the top 1% considerably. To some extent, the top 10% wealth share has stagnated, but the top 1% wealth share keeps on increasing. The counterpart is, if you look at who is losing in this whole scenario, you will find that it's actually the middle 40% who has lost the majority of the share. And that is what we call the loss of this middle class.
Interesting. So, I mean, why do you think that is broadly? You know, is it the right people with the right political connections? And, you know, what role does that play in the distribution of wealth in India?
There are lots of things which come into picture when we talk about this rising inequality. But indeed, one thing this rising inequality is suggesting you is that the growth rate in India is not getting distributed equally. So somehow the gains are being limited in few hands. We looked at this wealth by different caste groups. And even within the Forbes billionaire list, let's say the top 150 people, their wealth, it has reached to about 25% of GDP. So you can imagine the huge wealth which is concentrated at the very top. And then when you look further deeper into it, you will find almost no new billionaire from OBCs who have come up. And it's only the upper caste, they are the ones who are popping up in this billionaire list.
But also, I mean, there's another element to this story, and that's a disparity between different age groups. There's a huge youth unemployment crisis. So how severe is that youth unemployment crisis? What do you think happens when a larger share of the nation's young people don't feel like they're getting a piece of that economic growth?
That's a very good question. If you look at the population age group of 20 to 60, which is sort of like the working age group, you find in India, 40% of population in that age group is declared that they are not working. One thing what I have found is that Indian education system is very lopsided towards producing social scientists, which is not a new thing. It's actually historically from last 100 years, if you look at the shares, our 50 to 60% of graduates are coming from social sciences. In recent years, there is a growth in production of engineers, but the share, it has increased to only 15%. I give you an example of China, where in China, for last 100 years, 30% of total graduates are engineers. So even today, where we are producing lots of engineers, it is half of what China produces, and it is producing from last 100 years. So when we want to develop, let's say, manufacturing sector, where we want to push a lot of population from agriculture sector to manufacturing sector, we are unable to do that because our human capital is not apt. You are producing very high level, high skill or highly educated graduates, but it's from a discipline who will not find jobs later on. I would say the discontent among population, especially among young people, is going to rise because of this, where they think they have, let's say, gone to school, but at the end of the day, you have no job opportunities. It has been shown that it reduces the subjective happiness among population.
How much does growing wealth inequality shape India's future going forward? You know, is it going to be the major roadblock that stops India becoming the economic superpower that Prime Minister Modi claims it is guaranteed to become?
I think it depends on also how from now the government takes approach, right? Like whether you do want to target inequality. India is indeed growing. It is the growth rate is there, but I think the high inequality is reducing the potential of India to achieve more growth. Like as I mentioned before, if your 40% of population is not part of the economic workforce, and within them a lot of educated individuals, if they are not forming the part of economic workforce, that is indeed pushing down the growth rate. There is a lot of emphasis on like growth. Everybody just keeps talking about growth and so on. There is a potential threat that if the inequality is not checked, it will reduce the growth of India.
Wonderful. Dr. Bharti, thank you so much. But all of this economic growth might be stopped by one thing: climate change. Analysts believe that if the worst impacts of the crisis are not mitigated, India's economy could lose as much as 10% of its value by the end of the century. You can already see the impact it's having on India's farmers.
The angst at the largest protest site is most acute among young protesters from Punjab, the northern state whose farmers dominate the discontent.
Climate change is lowering the yields of India's farmers, leading them to protest. Lower rainfall, changing weather patterns, and the enormous spike in heat waves are making the industry increasingly precarious.
Hovered as high as 47 degrees Celsius in Delhi today. Heat waves are common.
93 million Indians are employed in agriculture. And as agricultural jobs become more difficult and yields are lower, it means fewer workers are required to do it, especially as the industry modernises. What this leads to is rapid urbanisation. This doesn't make climate impacts better, but in fact makes them far worse.
The heat is not only a risk to children. Many people are suffering in the high temperatures.
The morning rush hour is always busy, but here it is also deadly.
To stop work to reduce hazardous air pollution that is blanketing cities in noxious smog.
India already struggles with air pollution and the availability of water. As climate change rumbles on and the glaciers of the Himalayas shrink, India's ability to have fresh, running water decreases.
We are that sad now, we don't even think that this is something politicians can fix because they never talk about it. Traffic is our problem, roads are our problem, hospital is your problem.
Last year, the World Bank labelled India the planet's most water-stressed country, comprising 18% of the world's population but holding just 4% of its water resources. As India urbanises, more of that inadequate water supply becomes undrinkable, thanks to pollution and contamination. And the more areas that turn from rural farmland to concrete jungles, the more population density increases. It has India on a collision course with existential environmental issues. And yet, it's not a huge factor in this national election. To provide perspective on the ground, let's talk to Piya Srinivasan, a commissioning editor at 360 Info based in Delhi. She's also an assistant professor at Manavratna International Institute of Research and Studies. Piya, you wrote a book about the impacts of climate change in India. So what major issues does India face in its fight against the climate crisis? And, is this currently part of the discourse in this election?
A report that I was reading recently said that about 90% of India experiences close to severe climate change impacts on an almost daily basis. It is sort of that pronounced, that intense. And I think now the big difference is that there isn't a day when a distinct, like climate-driven catastrophe isn't making the news. In my lifetime, like cyclones were a 1 in 10 years thing. But now, over the last year, we have at least 3 big cyclones every year. When I left Delhi today, it was temperatures were around 47 degrees. And day before yesterday, there was an area in Delhi that recorded a temperature of 52.3 degrees, which is, sort of really touching the limits of what they call human survivability.
Delhi soared to above 52 degrees Celsius. That's believed to be the highest temperature ever recorded in India.
And so that is one reality that North India and different parts of India are undergoing as we speak, and has been like this through a lot of the elections. The climate crisis can also be understood as a crisis of livelihood, right? And it can be understood as a crisis of sustainability. And it definitely is a crisis of public health. In the elections, in the political parties, they're addressing unemployment.
What are the major parties offering in terms of climate policy in this election?
There's sort of a tangential sort of reference to the climate without centering it as a climate crisis, right? I don't think that the climate crisis is being addressed as, these links are not very apparent in the electoral discourse at all, right? And I think at the ground level, the people who face it the most, right? Farmers, for instance, and it's the consequence of the climate on food productivity, right? That gets sort of not masked, but represented as a crisis of unemployment without a very grounded sort of addressing of the issues that people want the state and stakeholders and political parties to address. India is going through this very interesting sort of transitional phase where we're a strong economy, and then finally, for instance, in the summers, prices have become democratized, or you can afford, like even a poor person might be able to afford an air conditioner. So we're finally seeing sort of development of growth in that sense where, things become more affordable, but it's also come at this critical juncture, right, of history where, this is damaging for the environment. So, even the Congress's manifesto promises like renewable energy with jobs and growth, but there's no vision of integrating this into more broader everyday climate change impact problems. So again, then the focus remains on renewables and green energy, and what suffers is sort of different aspects or other aspects of the economy. It's predicted that labor productivity will be cut down by about 40% by in 2100. And what that effectively means is that being a worker in India is becoming so unsustainable, right? So while you are peddling the dreams of, green energy and net zero sort of emissions, you're also seeing a gradual, there's an approaching collapse that's almost imminent, right? Unless your approach to addressing climate change as a multi-pronged, multi-dimensional sort of a problem to address. So, just imagining like a holistic vision of addressing climate change doesn't really exist at this point. And this is, again, something that the manifestos of sort of the political parties, they're sort of piecemeal manifestos. They don't have an actual vision, how we are tackling unemployment, poverty, while addressing climate change. Like, they don't poll us, they don't meet. It's disjointed, right? And it's just peddling a lot of sort of big dreams to keep your global face.
Thanks for joining us, Piya. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. Next episode, we'll look at the results of this enormous democratic effort. Will Narendra Modi win a third term, or will the Congress have done enough to claw their way back to power? It's not too late to look at our in-depth coverage of India's elections. Head to 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation alongside university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner and Reese Hooker. Words by Lachlan Gaselli, research by Amber Holden, music by Jan Skubiszewski at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.